Okay, so it's 10:05 in Mexico City. So let's kick this off. Um, so welcome everyone to this session. Thank you for joining. We have people joining from across Latin America, which is exciting. So thank you everyone for joining. Before we start, I just wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded for to be able to share it with more people. So I hope that works out for everyone. I'm Karen Obseyevitz. Buenos dias. I'm president for Latin America for Porto Novelli. I'm based in Mexico City. And on behalf of Porto Novelli and the Global Situation Room, I'm delighted to welcome our clients, partners, and our teams to this interesting and very timely conversation. The aim of today's session is to explore how the recent events in Russia and Ukraine may impact the future business landscape in Latin America. We will focus on how this crisis may affect companies and brands in the region and how we should think about our reputation and our businesses in the near future. We want to help you, leaders in your own industries, to think about the future in a different way that is aligned with the current situation. As a global agency, Porto Novelli works with a variety of clients in many different markets, and we have designed this session specifically for our Latin America clients and partners. This is a chance for our team of experts to give you their immediate hot take on the current situation and respond to some of the most pressing questions today. So let me introduce you to the excellent panel of experts we have today from the Global Situation Room. Porto Novelli and Global Situation Room have worked together over the past years to develop cutting-edge tools designed to better navigate today's complex, high-risk business environment, a very demanding business environment right now, and to help you really navigate and make some planning and decisions in moments like this. We enable companies and their leaders to prepare for, respond to, and thrive amidst the regularity of today's risks. So first of all, let me introduce you to Bruen. He's the president of Global Situation Room. Brett, as director of global engagement at the White House, Brett Bruen built President Obama's Legacies International Initiatives. He was recently named by Washington Magazine as one of the nation's most influential voices on public affairs. As an American diplomat, he worked on the front lines of crises in Ivory Coast, Madagascar, Venezuela, and Iraq. As president of the Global Situation Room, his work focuses on helping clients from Fortune 100 companies to some of the world's largest philanthropies survive and thrive amidst the regularity of today's risks. Brett teaches crisis communication at Georgetown University and serves on boards at Harvard and University College Dublin. He speaks fluent Spanish and French. Bienvenido, Brett. Gracias. Second, it is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Francisco Santos, who's Executive Vice President of Global Affairs at the Global Situation Room. As a human rights advocate, former diplomat, journalist, and politician, Francisco is a venerable promoter of democracy and civic engagement. He comes to Global Situation Room after having served as Vice President of Colombia and most recently, Ambassador to the United States. During his tenure, he led Colombia's promotion of international trade, investment, and tourism. He was also integral in implementing policies combating corruption, extortion, and kidnapping. Prior to his political and diplomatic roles, Santos had a distinguished career in journalism and held several positions at El Tiempo, one of Colombia's leading newspapers. He also worked at El País, Spain's most prominent newspaper, and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Bienvenido, Francisco. Good to have you here. And last but not least, I want to introduce you to Dr. Robert Evan Eliis. Dr. Eliis is a research professor of Latin America Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on the region's relationship with China and other non-Western hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Eliis has published over 330 works, including the 2009 book, China in Latin America, The Whats and Wherefores, the 2013 book, The Strategic Dimension of Chinese Engagement with Latin America, the 2014 book, China on the Ground in Latin America, the 2018 book, Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean, and his just published work, China Engaged Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy. Dr. Eliis previously served as on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. So as you see, we have an amazing group of people today with us. Thank you all. Welcome, Dr. Eliis. Thank you for joining us. And with that, let's start our session. We will hear some opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then we will move to a Q&A session. We invite you to send any questions that you may have on the chat of the Zoom, and you can send them in English or Spanish, and we will try to address every question on our 45-minute session. So thank you, and Brett, why don't we kick it off with you?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to our partners at Porta Novelli for the opportunity to have this timely discussion. It comes at a moment where the international order has been upended, and we are beginning to see, I think, some of the collateral consequences from that, including in Latin America. And one of the major takeaways that I hope you will get from today's program is that while we are starting off with a discussion about Russia, its invasion of Ukraine, there is a precedent here. There is a real problem in how brands, in how businesses are going to need to look at their international investments, their supply chains, for years to come, and in places like China, in places across even Latin America itself. Because what we witnessed, and it was truly remarkable in the days that followed those Russian troops crossing over the border into Ukrainian territory, further into Ukrainian territory in the east, was that brands, the most significant, the most influential brands, made a decision not just to put out a statement, not just to reduce some staff or some operations, but in almost all cases, there are still a few exceptions, they withdrew from Russia. They followed along with the decision of their governments, of many Western as well as governments from other regions, to not only speak out on, but to sanction Russia. And what's interesting, and Ambassador Santos and I had a long conversation about this in Miami a few weeks ago, is that creates a powerful precedent for what we may see in terms of pressure applied to companies invested in, engaged in places where there are significant human rights and other issues of democracy and threats to freedom. Obviously, notably, Xinjiang province in Western China, a place that has now documented, at least according to our government here in the United States, committing genocide against the people of Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. Obviously, a crackdown on democracy, the treaty that China has with the United Kingdom for the space for democratic practice in Hong Kong. And let's not forget the situation in Taiwan. So all of those and Latin American companies are heavily invested, heavily dependent on Chinese companies, Chinese suppliers, and that, I think, should be a wake-up call. It should be a moment where companies, I gave a talk last month down in Richmond, the capital of Virginia, and these were agricultural exporters. And one of the things that was truly remarkable when I was talking to the Department of Agriculture here in Virginia was how extraordinarily dependent our exports, agricultural exports, are on China. And imagine a moment where China, as we've already seen, has not taken a similar stand, has not taken a strong stand on Russia. And the US, in cooperation with partners, should decide to take steps to sanction China, not only for their position on Russia, but if we were to see even worse violations of human rights, democracy, and notably, we were talking a little bit about it before we came on the air, there is a weakened Xi Jinping at the moment. The zero COVID policy has not gone well. It has shown some of the vulnerabilities in his system. So I think we will get into some of these issues, but I want to start off in a provocative place, hopefully, to really get people thinking about what do they need to do for that backup plan, for creating that redundancy in their supply chain, in their sales chain, so that there is hopefully a preparedness, not just for what we're going to increasingly see, and obviously from an agricultural standpoint, fertilizer, as well as access to Russian, Belarusian, other markets. We're already seeing reverberations, but that's going to continue. And I think, if I could make a prediction, the coming months and certainly the coming year will see replications of this kind of pressure on companies to take stands when we witness on our television screens, when we read it on our Twitter feeds about some of those horrendous cases of how other governments may be committing abuses, may be engaged in acts that do not reflect the kind of places that stockholders and shareholders, as well as consumers, want those brands producing their products, selling their products. It is a moment of unprecedented public relations challenges for companies these days.
Thank you, Brett. You put some interesting point that we will get back to those a little bit later. Thank you, Ambassador Santos. You want to share some of your initial thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you to all the panelists and to all our guests. Look, we lived in a changed world. I would definitely say that it's the end of the post-World War II era started with the war in Ukraine. American exceptionalism and Pax Americana, which meant the US becoming the good cop of the world, is no longer viable. And I think it's we're going to see a very different role of the US in the world. We're going to see a more unstable world, a world in which weapons are becoming and armies are the new intake. The example of Germany raising its investment in weapons to 2% of GDP just shows where this world is going. And unfortunately, with the detente that Putin was able to put forward in Ukraine by saying, I have nuclear weapons, will lead to more countries having nuclear weapons, because now they understand that that works as a barrier to protect your country. The pandemic changed the world and put the world of technology and work in the 21st century. It changed the way we think. The same is going to happen because of the Ukraine war. We are just starting the new 21st century in terms of the geostrategic battle for control of the world. And that geostrategic battle has economic elements and has political elements. But let me go to the region, because I think it's very important to you understand what's happening in the region. Latin America is the most dynamic region for this geostrategic battle. China has put forward a new vision of the world. We own Asia. Europe, with Russia and Russia included, should govern itself, and Latin America should be the area of the US. That's what they want, and that's what they want to go. I don't mention Africa because Africa is already gone. Africa is already in the hands of China. And in this geostrategic battle in Latin America, we need certainly the Western economies, the liberal economies, and the United States especially to pay very close attention. They're not. And they're not. As a matter of fact, Latin America is the fourth priority. First one, Europe, because of what's happening now. The second is Asia. And a few days ago, I was having dinner with the ambassador of the US here in Colombia. He's going to Korea. And I said, when are you going to pay attention, real attention to this battle? And he said, look, our first priority is Asia. And I understand it. So Asia is the second priority. The third is the Middle East. And the fourth is Latin America. So I think this is going to become a very difficult battle for Latin American countries to take away, especially when you see what Russia, what China, and what Iran are doing in the region. And that's and Ukraine has a big effect on that. And I think Dr. Eliis will speak more about China. But look, China is the #1 commercial partner of almost all of the Latin American countries in the region. They've moved from buying commodities to investing in ports, investing in railroads, investing in energy assets, and they've become very easy lenders, especially to those countries in which populist governments want very short-term results, and they put a lot of debt to the country that is practically unpayable. What happens in Venezuela, $60 billion, or in Ecuador, that has this huge problem of debt, is just an example of how they come. They say, here, we don't ask questions. You can take this money, but they don't know that this money really creates a difficult situation, especially for the fiscal situation of many of those countries. In infrastructure, I remember when I was ambassador trying to get American companies to bid in the subway operation of Colombia. None of them will. I remember a long time ago when Bechtel was a big player in Latin America. The US left many of those areas for other players. And I think now China being the biggest player, and China is building in Colombia used to the biggest ally of the US in Latin America, which is Colombia. The Chinese are doing the subway. The Chinese are doing one of the biggest highways in Colombia. So it's very important that the US and the companies in the US understand that there's a very big opportunity on infrastructure investment in Latin America. The creation of the DFC and the Build Act put money into it. So many of the American companies should start looking at how I can build the resiliency of my chain of production in Latin America, using those funds and using that new view of China in the US. Today, more than 80% of the Americans have a bad opinion of China. That wasn't so 5 years ago. And so it's important that many of the companies understand there's also a big opportunity. Russia, on the other hand, is a disruptor. They don't put anything in terms of commerce they're a small economy, but they're really good disrupting societies. And I think that with the crisis in Ukraine, they're going to see Latin America as the biggest push for destabilization, which is not something new for them. They used Cuba in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s to help the guerrillas in many of the countries of Latin America. Remember, all of Central America, in Colombia, they still, the biggest leaders of the FARC and the ELN are in Cuba, etc. So, but now it's not only Cuba. They have Venezuela, they have Nicaragua, they have Bolivia. And so this scenario is changing dramatically, and we will see more and more disruption from the Russians. I'll give you an example. There's an investigation of a group of Russians here that rented bank accounts of Colombians. Through those, they gave money to what they call the first line or primera línea of many of the protests in Colombia that practically destroyed the economy for many months. And it was fueled from there. I have no doubt that the protests in Chile had a lot to do with that, in Ecuador have a lot to do with that. And we will see that more and more and more in Latin America because it's a very low cost investment with a very high results. And finally, Iran. The other day, I read a column by the foreign minister said, there's a new world. It's a bipolar world. We are part of that world in which Russia, China, and Tehran will become the main axis of authoritarianism in the world. And certainly their footprint was small in Latin America. Now it's growing dramatically. They have lots of investments and are getting a lot of the money from gold and from different rare metals in Venezuela. They're managing some of the drug trafficking business in Bolivia. They do it through the Hezbollah that picks from the Lebanese communities that are very big in our region. They're disruptors too. What I've been told is that they are teaching the Venezuelans how to use the drones for this asymmetric war that we're going to see all over Latin America. They've been very successful. That's how they hit Saudi Arabia. That's how they hit Abu Dhabi, through drones sent very far away that were used to plant bombs and to hit the logistical and economic sectors of those countries. So with Russia and with Iran, we will see this asymmetric war expanding. They're very good at that, and a lot more disruption in our economies. We will come back to this, and with certain examples, how China has changed, how all this strategic battle is happening, but we'll leave that for the question and answer afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Santos. Interesting examples. Thank you for sharing. We'll come back to some of those. And now, Dr. Eliis, as an expert in China, what do you want to share with the group? You're on mute.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this. I'd like to agree with my colleagues. I see, especially in Latin America, that the region is facing, with this war and other factors, what I would call a perfect storm. As we recognize, there were not only the economic effects of COVID, which pushed an unprecedented number of people into more vulnerable positions in the informal sector and destroyed many small and medium enterprises, but in addition, left many governments in the region fiscally weakened, having jumped almost 10 percentage points in their debt as a portion of GDP, leading to pressures now in terms of tax policy and the needs to change the fiscal postures. In addition to that, of course, so we can recognize that the price effects of the Ukraine, especially in fuel prices and food prices, are beginning to have effects, socio-political effects, and impacting some of the most vulnerable sectors that were already weakened by COVID. On top of that, we have to recognize that the region is in a political transition. We can talk about the unprecedented shift to the left, but it's not that it's the left that's dangerous per se, although certainly there are some concerns in the changes of business orientation of some of the new governments and some of the expansion of the public sector that are contemplated if they are possible with limited options with the legislatures in the region. However, on top of that, one of the risks right now is that with these fiscal pressures and other pressures, the opportunities for these new governments to find themselves involved in crises, in paralysis that will affect the business environment and government performance. And of course, on top of this, as Ambassador Santos pointed out, the question of China and the role of China as an incubator of those new governments in transition as they move in potentially very worrisome ways, giving them leverage to oftentimes move against the private sector, against free markets, and to foster that political transition. I think it's important, without being extreme, we talk about three cases, two cases which I would put collectively in the less than 10% probability, and the one case that I'm going to talk about more extensively. So first of all, again, I think it's something that needs to be said, and this is something that would be unthinkable to say just a few months ago. But there is a non-zero possibility that this in Ukraine could escalate to a limited or broader nuclear exchange, particularly if Russia continues to blame the West, if Putin finds himself politically, internally in a corner and needs to change the level of the discourse. In addition to that, obviously, if that occurred, that would precipitate a possible global economic meltdown. At the end of the day, however, I frankly see, especially in a limited nuclear exchange, China coming out as the winner in that, because it essentially didn't start it, and because it will have economic opportunities in re-engaging with some of those markets. Number two, still a minor probability, but perhaps also worth saying, there are real possibilities that this could precipitate a new global economic crisis. We're already seeing the combination of petroleum and food price rises, supply chain shocks, inflation, interest rate rises, some of the difficulties in the financial sector. Remembering the interdependence between the West and the PRC, keep in mind, of course, that the West, especially Europe, is facing dramatic petroleum price shocks. It's facing food price shocks. It's facing weakened fiscal situations. And on the other hand, we have China facing that huge debt overhang that things like the Evergrande crisis brought to bear, as well as, again, recalling that China imports a significant amount of its foodstuffs and its oil. And so its own economies are dramatically impacted by that, as well as what you're all aware of, the zero COVID policy that China is pursuing, which really accelerates the fragility that we're seeing in President Xi's authoritarian system. And of course, Latin America is affected by the prospect of any type of global economic crisis through commodities prices, through reduced exports, through paralysis in the financial system, frankly, through the food sector, and through the precipitation of economic unrest. But in a more general sense, what I see as the most probable, and let's put this to 80 to 90% probability, just to put this into context, is that you have a situation in which this will continue to profoundly affect the economy of Latin America. Now, since this is about the effect of the war, it's important to at least mention that there are non-economic effects. I actually do not see an expanded Russian presence in the region. Even the friends such as Cuba, such as Venezuela, and such as Nicaragua, Russia has, in the war context, very few resources to help its friends and do anything meaningful, although it could project a threat, as Ambassador Santos so well points out they already are doing in Venezuela and endangering Colombia. But beyond that, you see that even some of the countries that would engage Russia in the larger but more market-oriented ways, Argentina and Brazil with the purchases of Russian foodstuffs, the sell to Russia of foodstuffs and the purchase of nitrate-based fertilizers, the risk there is that sanctions will probably hamper the ability to engage in those transactions. Now, with respect to China, I frankly see China being initially very cautious. China is historically, again and again, consistently very adept at trying to avoid being associated with the negative impacts while at the same time sticking with its friends. We've seen this in North Korea. We saw this with the regime in Venezuela. And we're seeing it now that even after that embrace and high-profile mutual proclamation in Beijing during the Olympics of the solidarity of China and Russia, we're now seeing China back off as Russia has performed and as the just abuses of human rights and things have come out. So in Latin America, there are reasons for China to be cautious, certainly because of the uncertainty in the economic situation, both because of COVID in Ukraine and the way that that's dampened consumer power in Latin America as people focus more on the buying of food and fuel and have to dedicate a greater percentage of their earnings to that. But I do believe that as things move on within 6 months to a year, and we all know how political cycles work and sometimes the most egregious things are forgotten. I see China coming out of this as the big winner in Latin America. It is firmly rooted with biopharmaceutical things, COVID co-production in the countries where it did its phase 3 trials, to also its increased importance as purchasers of everything from Brazilian and Argentine soy and meats to Ecuadorian shrimp to El Salvadoran sugar and other things, certainly products such as lithium in the lithium triangle and even in Mexico, possibly with Bacanora, and certainly copper and iron in Chile and in Peru, just to name a few things. Certainly the importance that China takes on as an investor, as the possibilities of other Western investors are weakened, just as occurred in 2008. And the possibility of China expanding its position in strategic sectors through mergers and acquisition activities, especially as soft markets and sell-off sell-offs by European and other firms in their Latin American holdings create buying opportunities for Chinese companies. Also, it's important to mention the prospect of Taiwan, the real prospect that as the Xiomara Castro regime in Honduras is already showing increasing signs of friction with the United States. I think at some point, Xiomara Castro completes her promise and recognizes the PRC. Haiti is also at risk. A number of the citizenship for investment countries in the region are at risk. And so a lot of possibilities for China through non-transparent MOAs to increase its position. This in the concept of also in the context of accelerated decoupling globally of the US and Chinese economies, not only in terms of manufacturing, creating nearshoring opportunities, but limited ones because of the difficulties in the region, but also affecting things like IT architectures and e-commerce. And let me conclude without going on too far, but just by saying that in terms of the political and economic crisis in Latin America, what I really see is a very uneven situation in which you have a simultaneous combination of political change, economic weakness, social protest, especially in Central America and the Caribbean because of the food and fuel price increases, but also in other places, as we've already seen in Peru. You also, I think, are going to see some strong performance in some sectors, particularly the petroleum and commodity sectors. I think Brazil looks good that way. I think Ecuador looks good that way, although social problems and also fiscal crises will create opportunities for disruptions even in those good places. And we can get into more detail about the countries in the Q&A, but some of the bright spots that I see in the region are frankly, Brazil, even with Lula, Uruguay with the Lacalle Pou government, Guyana, especially Guyana because it's a unique combination of agriculture, oil, and China. But there are, I think, a number of other opportunities and risks I think we can talk about in the Q&A. So those are my initial thoughts. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Eliis. Okay, well, I think most of us are thinking ahead and thinking about many questions. So I will start with some of the questions. And again, to our audience, if you want to share comments or questions through the chat, so please do that, and we'll try to respond to all of the questions. So the first question that I have, Brett mentioned, the need for companies to think about Plan B. What is the Plan B, and what else are you thinking of? So if you want to build a little bit more on that, how do you see this war affecting the way companies are thinking about their short and medium term plans for themselves? And what is it about that Plan B they need to be cautious about? Yes, Ambassador Santos.
Let me start by saying that I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be in the IT sector. What you saw in Huawei is going to become more and more and more the way in which many of the tech companies are going to have to deal with a very clear view from the US that companies and countries that invest in their network with China are going to have restrictions in terms of how they deal with the US. So the first area which I would create a Plan B is that one, because that's coming. Huawei is just the beginning, and to be very sincere, I see two platforms working in the world in 5 to 10 years, like it used to be with Betamax and VHS, and many of you who are young don't understand, but I see that happening. So I would emphasize in all the tech companies to take a look at what happened and how can that affect their vision, which tends to be globally, but I think there's going to be a decoupling in terms of tech between China and those countries and the West.
Just to add to what Ambassador Santos very smartly pointed out is, you got to look at some of the ways in which these political as well as security issues are going to create different systems. I mean, we've already seen, and Russia was well on its way to creating its own internet system that is self-enclosed. And that has major implications for how you do business. I would say, Karen, to your point about, what does a Plan B look like? Or what I should say is, at least from a public relations, public affairs standpoint, what do you need to have ready? Obviously, operationally, you've got to have alternative suppliers, alternative markets, and that's a key one. How are you now exploring if we aren't going to be able to sell into certain key markets? We continue to mention China, but there are others as well. What are you doing now to cultivate relationships with other countries, for instance, in Southeast Asia, India, as well as others around the world? Those efforts have to start now. You've got to be looking at building that work, as many on this call will know. It does take time. It takes the knowledge of that market, the establishing of your brand in that market, as well as obviously the relationships, let alone permissions and other factors. Additionally, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of, and it's been accelerated during this period of time, and to the points that both Dr. Eliis made, as well as Ambassador Santos, if we're going to see a lot of upheaval across Latin America, whether it's with populism and populist leaders, or the kind of uncertainty and concern at the level of, I think it's a very important point to talk about the economic precariousness that many vulnerable populations have been put into. And let's not forget, and this is out there as a kind of flashing warning signal, the food security crisis that isn't going to so much take hold this year, but it's next year when those crops are not coming onto the global market. And we're seeing the kind of nationalism and protectionism of certain food staples, of certain inputs like fertilizer. And so all of a sudden, with that instability rising up in different countries across Latin America, and so many of your brands affiliated with that national brand, but also obviously the concern, whether it's on the part of investors, whether it's on the part of those that you supply. Are you going to be able to deliver on time? Are you going to be able to deliver the same number of orders as you have in the past? How are you putting in place the right level of, we call it a counter-crisis infrastructure, that builds the trust, the forgivability factor if there should be disruptions, so that you're able to weather that storm? You're able to ensure that a disruption on a political or on a security level isn't going to cost you the access to a key market, the access to key sales opportunities. So I would just be putting in place that foundational work now.
Thank you, Brett. Yes, Dr. Eliis?
Mute.
Just very quickly. First, in reaction, I think something very important that Ambassador Santos said with respect to the decoupling, and it extends far beyond telecommunication. It also includes surveillance systems. We're familiar with Hikvision's acquisition, for example, a Syscom that they're in Mexico. But I think this is becoming also a major political issue. It also goes into data systems with Huawei and its data centers throughout the region. It goes to rideshare applications. It goes to B2B. So this ripples through areas far more broadly than the 5G. But I think the other thing that also, Brett, I just wanted to jump on what Brett said, is this notion of the number of different risks and ways in which indirectly this can affect companies, because you can look at it in terms of the uncertainty. You can look at it in terms of factor input costs in energy costs and transport costs in specific inputs like fertilizer, et cetera. You can also look at it with finance costs, because again, for plant and equipment and in other things, the impact of financing, as we're already seeing those interest rate rises, pushed by inflation and other things. Brett alluded to this also, but frankly, different companies affected affected in different ways, but supply chain issues. So, for example, physical transportation blockades of getting to market, as well as other things where a particular supplier is not able to provide something either, someplace else in the world or even in the country. And frankly, also questions of demand, not only some of the political questions that have been brought up, but also the questions of how this impacts, on the one hand, demand from traditional Western exporters of the United States, but also the way in which this affects demand from locals. Again, these unequal price rises are going to shift essentially what the available consumer basket is in terms of luxury goods, non-critical goods, and that will affect a string of industries. And so in many different ways, far beyond Russia itself and far beyond China, this is having ripple effects throughout virtually every sector of Latin American economies. And I think Brett points out very well, it's very important to have that plan B of, what do we do when, everything the way that we've worked for the past generation suddenly is coming unraveled.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Eliis. So just building a little bit on the industries, you mentioned a couple of industries that should put a lot of attention and plan ahead. But there's one industry, we have many guests today from the financial services and fintech companies in Latin America. As you know, there's a boom of fintech in the region, a lot of innovation coming out of Chile, Brazil, Argentina. How do you see that this situation will affect the financial sector? Yes, Dr. Eliis, please.
Yeah. First of all, one quick note, and I think it's interesting that the fact that especially in Brazil, the Chinese are just beginning to get into the fintech. Not so much the banking for the unbanked, but I think they're going there as well, as we saw with I think a new bank specifically. But more broadly, I think an important thing about fintech is recognizing that it relies so much, at least a certain component relies on an understanding of algorithms that come from social media and other things to be able to adjust for risk and find profit in banking to the unbanked. However, if we're talking about fundamental changes in the social fabric, we're talking about political mobilization, we're talking about basically a shift in the very situation of some of the core people that fintech is oriented towards. This is not my area of expertise, but what I see on the political side leads me to see the possibility of a change in the basis of some of the things that's made those business models for some of those new startups, so successful.
Yes, Ambassador Santos.
Another element of it, and I think when you see the sanctions in Ukraine that the U.S. and the Western world put on Russia, I think that's going to be used more and more and more. It's going to be the primary tool in how to try to achieve a political result without the use of let's say it, hard power, that's soft power, those type of decisions. So yesterday I was talking to somebody from Scandia, a very big pension fund in Colombia. They have everything. They used to be owned by a very big South African fund that had insurance, etc. Now it's owned by a Chinese company. Those new owners, and I would be very careful, are going to become part of a big discussion if a problem like that presents and the US and the Western nations say, we got to stop this in the near future. So speaking of Plan B, take a look at who owns those companies, because one of the things that China has been doing very well, and that's something we're going to have to contend for the next probably decades or centuries, is that they are buying very well-known, reputed companies in Europe and in South Africa, etc. And they are buying, and they are now the owners of a big part of, or at least now, a part of that financial sector.
Thank you. Thank you, which brings us to the issue of cybersecurity. And you touched technology, you touched startups and financial platforms. There's been a lot on cybersecurity recently. So what is your take on that? Is the risk bigger, larger than before? How are we dealing with those threats? Yes, Dr. Eliis.
Well, and certainly we've seen with Costa Rica and Peru these vulnerabilities, but I think we have to go back to when we were all jumping into virtual meetings and things like that with, sometimes marginal security protections, because at the moment, many of those networks and accounts that were compromised are beginning to come home to roost now. And certainly you see a much broader threat. You see a Russian dimension to the threat as you've seen playing out now. You see a Chinese dimension to the threat. Some of the Chinese companies in looking for technology, frankly, and not just mischief, have been targeting Latin American countries as well as others. But I think the broader threat goes to the new ways that we are doing business, and especially as we move more into the digital realm. And going back to something that Ambassador Santos said also, I think it's important. I think you're going to see a lot more emphasis brought from the US and Europe in coming years on this. Again, the security of the digital space with China's 2017 national security law and some of the interest as you have, companies like Huawei, which are the backbone of everything from data centers to 5G and the Internet of Things, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't just create, it's not just great power competition. It doesn't just create risks for governments and the compromise of government personnel when they, talk to their significant others on their Huawei phones. But specifically, it also raises, I think, very grave questions of the security of intellectual property and the security of being able to engage in competitions in countries in Latin America that significantly are penetrated in their telecommunication systems and in their data centers and things by unreliable companies, and especially given that interest of the Chinese already demonstrated in China and elsewhere in the world of using that access through the service of the state to gain things that will give commercial advantage to their companies. So I think there's a real IP data security thing that goes beyond just the current headlines, but certainly there's the dimension that COVID opened up, but there's also the broader dimension of where vulnerable architectures are going for companies that locate their IP in Latin America in these new architectures.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Ambassador Santos, you want to add something?
Very, very, very short.
Yes, sure.
Very short. With Russia as a disruptor, one of the main instruments of disruption is this type of disruption. And unfortunately, from Mexico to Brazil, most of our countries are military or banking sector, etc. Yeah, they do a safe quality against this type of attacks, but not to the level that it's going to come. We need our countries in Latin America to design very well and institutionalize a very strong cybersecurity entities within the government. No country in Latin America has it.
Just to build off of that point, Karen, we have not yet seen Putin's retaliation for what are crippling economic sanctions. And it doesn't mean that he's going to respond simply on the battlefield, simply by imposing some of his own sanctions. Putin has a playbook, and it's a well-used playbook that now I fear, are going to witness on a scale with a sophistication that has not yet been seen. And it is going to target businesses. It is going to target economies, because he wants to impose on both, the countries like the US, Europe, but also Latin America, because we are interconnected, because there is, I think, a desire simply to foment chaos and crisis. And that will come in the form of cyber attacks and the weaponization of information. It will come in the form of trying to create, remember, there are three things that Putin wants. I spent time battling Russian disinformation when I was at the White House in the very early days of the war in Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk. One, he wants to sow doubt. Secondly, he wants to create division. And then thirdly, to damage institutions and ideals. And those three are going to come back with a vengeance as Ambassador Santos said, during that election period, but we need to, and I think there is a false sense of security that this only is limited to the political space. That same kind of toolbox is now going to be deployed against stock markets, against businesses, and already trying to exploit some of the tension, the division, and the doubt that exist about the confidence in our economies. So watch out.
Wow. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. So I would like to touch on some of the issues that are ingrained in Latin America already, like security, social, social division, political changes in the countries, organized crime, drug traffic. How are you seeing like these issues getting bigger? I'm afraid because as a result of this war. Yes, Dr. Eliis, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, certainly going back to COVID-19 and deepening now with the Ukraine war with respect to organized crime, on the one hand, you had a change in pattern that we're still trying to play catch up to. You had a shift in the relationship between cartels like Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación, the transportistas in Central America, and groups in Colombia. Meanwhile, there's a fragmentation going on. New techniques in order to get around border closures and supply disruptions, increased use of narco subs and things like that. But frankly, it goes beyond even that. You see that, for example, in terms of the ability of gangs to get more entrenched in their communities as they, reinforced COVID lockdowns, as they provided aid. And at the same time, we see the security forces, which responded admirably at the request of their political leadership to COVID missions, but now find themselves with postponed needs for their modernization projects. They find themselves with more limited resources as they face this expanded threat, as they face specifically people who, again, are pushed into those marginalized populations. Increased informal sectors make it harder to go after money laundering when you have a larger cash economy. It increases the number of people who are willing to engage in certain types of illicit infrastructures and in teams. That makes things much more difficult. It increases the amount of common crime and insecurity. And certainly we see the increase in protests that we're seeing from the increase in fuel and in other price rises, as we're already seeing in Honduras, as we're already seeing in Guatemala, as we're already seeing particularly so in Peru, and the way that interfaces with, as Ambassador Santos pointed out, the weaponization of protests by a hardcore left with an agenda, so to speak, the Castro Chavistas, but at the same time, also the play into the empowerment of these new frustrated groups with societies in political transitions, with governments that may be completely democratic. I believe in the democratic credentials of Gabriel Boric, for example, in Chile, but I believe that he, as others, find themselves in a very precipitated condition when they can't get their legislative agenda through a middle-of-the-road Congress. They're facing pressure on the left. So, for example, in Chile, either way you go, the left or right, if the Constituent Assembly is not voted through, you either get violence because it's not voted through, or you get investor flight because it is. And so I think in organized crime and in social protest, we are in for really kind of a revolution across the region that will play itself out in different ways in different countries.
Yes, so there is a question about someone in the public that says that as tensions over Ukraine continue to rise between Russia and the West, Moscow has hinted at plans to deploy military forces in Latin America, specifically in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So just to build on what you just responded, what are your thoughts on this? And I think with this, we will then wrap it up. Yes.
Okay, well, specifically, that's not going to happen. That was consistent with the threats that were made in the past in 2008 and 2013 with the T-160 backfire bombers. Right now, Russia does not have the military infrastructure to deploy significant capabilities in the region. It doesn't have the capability to offer significant aid packages, and frankly, it wants to control its escalation risks outside of the region. As a matter of fact, it was interesting the Yuri Borisov visit, in which they signed that military agreement with Venezuela, it was notable for the absolute lack of details. Now, the Russians are absolutely doing some things in the region. Ambassador Santos mentioned what Colombia's defense minister mentioned, Diego Milano, not too long ago, about Russia's participation in helping Venezuelans in Apure and other places. So the Russians are active in doing mischief, and certainly in the cyberspace. But I do not see, either in economic terms or in security terms, anything more than the deployment of a limited threat from the Russians, at least in the near term.
Okay, thank you. So I know we have some additional comment, but we are on time. We want to respect the time of everybody. So I think this gives us content for a second version of this session. Brett, you want to close it out?
Just thanks to you and to your team for helping to put this together. I know Porter Novelli offices across Latin America helped to get the word out. And as you said, I think there is a richness to looking at some of these risks. And unfortunately, risks are both growing and getting more complicated. And I think the smart business leaders are trying not just to focus on the shiny object of what may be a concern in this moment, but looking beyond that to what's around the corner and the ramifications as we've seen, whether it's with China and some of the shipping challenges out of Shanghai, whether it's clearly with Russia and the agricultural impacts, the cyber impacts, as well as just the economic implications of that conflict. My question to those in the audience right now, what's next? What is that next crisis? Because we have been subjected to, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's the political populism both here in the US as well as across Latin America, now war. There is, unfortunately, and I've learned this the hard way, both as a public affairs practitioner as well as helping clients, that crises tend to beget more crises. They tend to lead to more vulnerabilities being exposed. So thinking about, as we return to office, to some semblance of normalcy, there are going to be a whole lot of vulnerabilities, both because of COVID, both because of the political and security situations that will be exposed. So doing that audit of your team, doing that audit of your plan, and really trying to zero in on what could go wrong. So on that optimistic note, I will thank everyone for joining us and look forward to the next discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and see you in our next session. Thank you. Have a great day. Buena tarde. Buenos días a todos.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, Brett.